Welcome to Standard Life Investments Global Emerging Markets Debate, split into 4 sections. This one, good question, this one, where next? Right, let's go macro. What is still emerging?
I think actually an interesting thing to think about over the next few years is with China's rapid development and increase in its relative labour costs, then one of its sort of traditional comparative advantages is diminishing. I mean, that in the exploitation of low-cost labour. And so then the question is, okay, so who can benefit from that development now? Who can move into that space and capture market share from China in the lower reaches of the value-added chain? And so there sort of things like Vietnam is an interesting sort of country to think about. Also, you know, somewhat, maybe it might sound a little unusual, but also Mexico. Mexico's relative unit labour costs are very, very low in manufacturing, lower than China's, lower than Brazil's, and so I think that's one of the interesting themes to think about. Also, as the nature of Chinese development changes, so you switch from a very commodity-intensive form of growth to something more focused on the services sector and less investment-intensive. You know, which countries through trade linkages can benefit from that compared to, say, some of the commodity exporters that benefited from that first sort of surge of growth?
I think political stability is going to be an important factor to see which emerging markets perform well over the next few years. Certainly, India is a story that's been consistent.
Well, yeah, tell me what you think about the new man, or newish man in charge. I mean,
well, I like his emphasis on economic development. I think India's always had the issue of strong economic development, but it's always had a terrible record, I think, in distribution of wealth. It's got this massive dichotomy. I think the wealth needs to spread not just in the middle sector and the high level sector, but down to the villages, the poor end.
Salman, define some more emergings.
Sure. I think I guess I'll take a step back in the sense, like, I think for me the age we are going to see going forward is of very sharp fundamental differentiation, which I think some of the panelists have already touched upon. Although I've been covering emerging markets for the last 15 years, and there has always been this talk about heterogeneity, divergences. But to be fair, when you go back to the data and the market behavior, it has never been borne out like that. So in the period before 2003, 2007, we had very close performances or close behavior of these emerging markets, and then we saw the financial crisis. It's really after last year that we are seeing this divergent theme-based emerging themes emerging, and I classify that as a theme called like winners, survivors, and losers. So you have to, like, I think, assess every country on its own merit. And I think India is a solid story.
I totally agree. I mean, demographics for me is one of the most exciting things, always has been, about emerging markets. We like young nations. We like to see young workforce and not many retired people. Developed markets are entirely the opposite way around. You can get quite gloomy and depressed about it. So, strong demographics. So you've got to include, again, in North Africa, you've got to include Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya. These are the next nations in the frontier markets that are going to, move towards emerging.
Mark, should we address the fact of monetary tightening and just wonder which particular economies are going to be hit most by that?
Yeah. So in a way, I think that's something that's reflected pretty quickly in the markets. Yep. We've seen that with the taper tantrum last year, and we've seen it again to some extent over the last month or so. So I think that is reflected pretty quickly. I think what's positive is that we've seen some countries take action on the back of that. So so we've seen the Indian current account deficit improve. We've seen subsidies start to be reduced. We've seen interest rates move up. We've seen the same thing in Indonesia. These are actually positive changes that are for the medium-term good of these economies. So it's true that funding costs are rising. Your cost of capital is going up, definitely. Then the question is that priced in or not? We think broadly it is, and certainly then it comes down to, can you find exciting stocks that you want to buy?
Yeah, and should in terms of what's going into the emerging market space, does it tend always to be frontier markets? And if so, which are they? Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, I guess you can almost defining it in those terms, right? Which is, in a sense, you're trying to. I mean, historically, most countries don't make the leap, right? You have to recognise that. You know, if you look over the past 100 years, the average convergence rate of all the countries below the developed countries is fairly slow, and only a small number of countries have moved from emerging to developed, or from frontier into emerging. And so again, what you need to do is you need to look very closely on a country by country basis and say, okay, who's making genuine change? Who's undertaking the sorts of reforms that can enable sort of growth to be fostered, that can encourage sort of capital to move into that country, you know, so that you can sort of really significantly boost productivity. Demographics are important. In a sense, they give you, you know, they are one tailwind. As I say, if you're looking for living standards to improve, you need to be saying, okay, where is it possible for productivity growth to take a leap upwards? One reason why people are a bit more excited about Mexico is that after a long period of very, very dismal relative performance, they finally seem to be getting some of these sort of structural issues dealt with. And so there might be an opportunity for them to realise that growth potential that's always been latent, but never actually recognised.
How do you view frontier markets? Do they come within your purview?
Yeah, absolutely. We are excited at the prospect of frontier markets, but again, it comes back to the earlier issues in regards to liquidity, in regards to how to access that growth, and it comes back to the divergence in terms of how do you measure each and every economy. In regards to frontier markets, there's, you know, living standards, and some of them are by all means very advanced, very developed, but then there's other aspects in terms of, you know, impediments to trade.
Anybody from the floor? Yeah.
Thank you. It's Alex Brandreth from Brown Shipper here. Just on the investment side, then, when would you start to look at a frontier market when it's being promoted into the emerging market sector, and how do you stay ahead of the curve? Because clearly there's going to be a lot of natural buyers for ETFs nowadays as well.
So we think that the distinction between what's an emerging market and what's a frontier market is a little bit arbitrary. So UAE and Qatar have just gone into emerging. Are they even emerging at all? And why were they in frontier before that? Similarly, Saudi isn't in either. Georgia isn't in either. But we've got interesting investment ideas in all of these countries. So we don't make a big deal about which benchmark it's in, really. The question is there interesting change taking place? So you take, we've been talking about, obviously the oil dependency or resource dependency at, some of the frontier MENA countries. There is a realization in those countries that they've got to change. They've got to broaden the base of the economies. So we're not making a huge distinction between those two areas, where we've got our tools and the resources of the team that we try and focus on in go and find the interesting stock ideas where change is happening.
Thank you all very much indeed for exploring where next for global emerging markets. See you next time.